Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan.
Ar dús bhhaile mar rá gohfuil díama orm tuis go mbeidh míid ag vótáil a nocht, mar ceapan go mbeidh míid go léir ag aontu leis an gnó atá going a nocht. I heard the Minister speaking about the spring statement, and as if this was a justification for not accepting the bill. But the spring statement is one thing, a constitutional and enshrining these rights in the Constitution is another thing. And I do think it is disrespectful to the Constitutional Convention that that is the attitude that's being taken. I think if we're serious about economic, social and cultural rights, they're very valid, they're very relevant, and if we're serious about them, well then we will enshrine them in the Constitution. Our Constitution was drawn about a time when economic, social and cultural rights didn't have the profile that they have now, but now they do, so it is time to bring them into the Constitution. Because that Bunreacht na Héireann back in 1937, you know, there were a lot of positive things in it, and I know since then we've also signed up to quite a number of human rights instruments and charters. But going back to 1937 and having a look at what was there was a right to education, free primary education, there was the rights of parents, of the child, there was protection for freedom of expression, of assembly, of association, the Irish language and the right to property. There were other positive aspects to it as well, and I was struck by one or two of the quotes when I was just looking at it, that the state will strive to promote the welfare of the whole people by securing and protecting as effectively as it may a social order in which justice and charity will inform everything. Special care of the economic interests of the weaker sections of the community and, where necessary, contribute to the support of the infirm, the widow, the orphan and the aged. And another one in relation to the health of workers. Now, I think if we had stronger enshrining of economic, social and cultural rights, we would not have seen some of the policies and some of the cuts and some of the budget decisions that we have seen in the intervening years. So I do think it's vital that we look very seriously at what's being proposed here tonight. One other point in relation to Article 45, that the directives or principles of social policy are intended for the general guidance of the Oireachtas and not cognizable by any court under any of the provisions of the Constitution. And at the briefing last week, which Deputy Pringle organised, where we were addressed by Amnesty International, we were looking at that point, which is that the state will progressively realise, and it's subject to its maximum available resources, which on one hand could be seen, you know, that it's kind of sad that it's allowing an excuse for government not having the resources, but it was, I suppose, allowing a freedom that we all could agree on this tonight, including the government side. I think if the government had accepted the bill, it would be to acknowledge the kind of society that we want for Ireland, by specifically including economic, social and cultural rights in our Constitution. We're saying that we are committed to a just, inclusive and fair society. You know, I've acknowledged what's positive in the Constitution, and really what's being proposed here, it's complementing the rights, some of the rights that are there already. And I think what we're debating, it's not an issue for the left, it's not an issue for the right, it's not an issue for the centre, or left to centre, right to centre. I think it's something for the whole country, all the citizens in this country. Now, I too was a member of the Constitutional Convention with Deputy Murphy, and 85% voted in favour of amending the Constitution to include these rights. The government made certain provisions in relation to recommendations from the Constitutional Convention to respond within a certain time frame, but that's not happening, not just with this one but with others as well. The response to economic, social and cultural rights was to have been in July last, so we're very much running behind. Yet last week on 2 occasions the Dáil was left without any business to discuss. On one hand, I think it was because legislation moved much quicker than was anticipated, but why was there not provision for another debate? And this one could have fitted in very well there. Equally, why could a Friday not be designated, one of the Fridays, to looking at the recommendations to bring it up to speed, or at least giving another Friday in order to do this? The bill is about enshrining these rights in our Constitution, and underneath them all of what's proposed in the bill, I think, is a principle of human dignity. I think that underpins these rights. And I believe we can move forward with principles and rights being enshrined without having the necessary resources to allow for what can be managed within the existing resources. There was another poll which said that 81% agreed with the government expenditure being based on rights. And I think that's a very significant poll. I had a private members myself about human rights-based budgets. And even though there was a lot of support from government government speakers, acknowledging the validity of what I was proposing, it was voted down. But this was something that was coming, as tonight is coming, from organisations who are working directly on the ground with very marginalised and vulnerable people. There was other aspects to the debate on this during the Constitution Convention. It was very open, it was very frank, and all those things were considered. For example, what soft rights, what were hard rights. They were looking at the lack of concrete proposals. They looked at unintended consequences, looking at the role of government, parliament and the role of the judiciary. And there was a particular discussion around the right to housing. What exactly does that mean? Does it mean the right to a 2-bed apartment, a 3-bed house, a bedsit or a bed in a hostel? So can we accept these rights without the constitutional reform? That was also discussed, because the point was made that there's other bodies there who could ensure this, the Ombudsman, various watchdogs, to ensure the rights of citizens. We have EU law, we have international law, and that we could do it through reforming the Dáil, through legislation or through local government reform. All very valid arguments. But the upshot from the Constitutional Convention was 85% of people felt that all those other suggestions weren't enough, that we should enshrine them in our Constitution. So I think that is important as principles in our vision for the kind of society that we want. Now, looking at housing and the right to housing. We could look at the Scottish model. There's a right to a home. It has a legislative basis which changed local authority practice. The Scottish system therefore engages with people at risk of homelessness, not when they are homeless. And because of this right, the local authority has to be told of someone in the private rented sector who's threatened with eviction. And this came through agreed political consensus. I have a bill waiting to make it onto the floor about this, that I worked with housing organisations, which would bring in the same here for the local authority not to have to wait until somebody is actually homeless, that they could deal with it beforehand. Scotland recognised that having people homeless and in emergency accommodation is very expensive. We know that too, not to mention the other costs, the emotional and psychological costs. Glasgow City were able to close their emergency accommodation because it wasn't needed, and whereas in this country our housing situation is worsening. The benefits of enshrining it in the Constitution, well, it will be a guide to legislators. I mean, what's being proposed is not extreme, because they are part of the international body of human rights. They allow for decision-making and in a transparent way, and also that decisions will be evidence-based. And we did sign the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in 1973, and we ratified it in 1989. If they had been enshrined, if those rights had been enshrined in our Constitution, we could look at some of the messes that might have been avoided. For example, the right to just and favourable conditions to work. Well, we mightn't have the whole chaos over zero-hour contracts, the threat of privatisation. If everybody had the right to join a trade union, that particular right, and the right to strike, well, we wouldn't have employers giving ultimatum to their workers not to be in a union, or paying lip service to the idea of negotiating with their staff. Protection of the right to housing. We wouldn't have, as I brought up with leaders last week, children living in appalling situations in homeless accommodation, in direct provision, children in care because their mothers cannot access housing. The highest standard of physical and mental health. I think we are one of the few EU countries who do not have designated mental health nurses in our A&E departments for those who present there with mental health issues. The right to education. Huge progress has been made, but we still have low rates of progression to third level from certain socio-economic groups. If we look at our society, there is income inequality, there are failures to meet the health needs of our citizens, we have an appalling situation, so needs are not being met. And what we're doing is we are increasing inequality. Both the proclamation in 1916 and the democratic programme of the first Dáil, they were underpinned by principles of equality of treatment. And this is what this bill is just enabling to do, that our current constitution will also do that. I want to acknowledge Deputy Pringle's bill, and I want to acknowledge Deputy Healy allowing it to be promoted in his time. Yeah, it is challenging, but at the end of the day, what are we to be afraid of when we enshrine human rights in our constitution?